Before we jump into today's topic, a quick disclaimer. The stories and data we share come from the states that we practice in and the experiences that we personally had, which can differ greatly across our country and certainly the globe. This is not a professional advice show. So let's get comfy and talk about death.
Welcome to MortMic, a down-to-earth discussion on death and dying. I'm Jem.
And I'm Red, and we are your authorities on the afterlife this week.
Now, I'm sure we've all had this experience as death professionals. Your significant other invites you home to family holiday dinner for the first time ever. You know exactly what you are about to endure. And no, not just the normal prodding life story questions. As you're all sitting around the dinner table, Aunt May has finally had enough glasses of wine to ask you the question.
And that's the good wine, too.
Exactly. So, what do you do for a living? Oh, I just work at a hospital. Oh, wow, a doctor? No, actually, I work in the morgue. She gasped, clutching her chest. My word. Yeah, I work for the medical examiner. I investigate deaths and assist with autopsies. She's fanning herself now, about to faint. The rest of the family sits aghast in silence. I could never. After a couple more minutes of trying to explain your job using the nicest, cushiest, most death-positive words ever, Aunt May shakes her head. I just don't know how you'll deal with that every day. It must be so sad.
On the other hand, I also, my aunt took it the absolute opposite way, where she was just like, oh my gosh, you're like Abby from NCIS. And now every time she sees me, that she always calls me Abby. So you're getting both sides of things.
Yeah, I do have those people too occasionally, especially it's a little jarring when it's like a little old grandma that's like, wow, that's so fascinating. But I think we've all had this experience as death professionals. Death is not really something that people want to talk about, believe it or not.
Oh, absolutely not. No, my one aunt's at the table trying to ask me, oh, how do you do this? How do you do that? And then my grandparents are just staring at her like, oh my God, please burn your death. We don't want to hear about this.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Definitely when I went to my partner's house for the first time for a family meal, that was like the exact situation that happened. And I was like, oh God, get me out of here.
Right. Oh, I'm going to go take the trash out, or I left my house on fire. I got to go.
Yeah. So as death professionals, we are exposed to death every day. And as you can understand, that leads us to think about death every single day of our lives. And that's not something that people are really accustomed to or people really want to think about every day.
Yeah, absolutely not. And there's a lot of reasons that people are adverse to either talking about death or dealing with it. And also just some people are just scared of death. Is it going to hurt? Is my death going to be dignified? Did I get to do everything that I wanted to do before my final days? But what about those people that see death on the daily? This really is the question, isn't it? Have those in death care stared into the void and had it stared back, and they're totally cool with it? Or what else?
So if we're being honest here, I do have a tendency to think of every possible scenario to every single situation I'm in. That's just the kind of person I am. And I'm also 100% sure that I've either seen or thought about death every single day for the past 7 years that I've been a practicing death professional. That's a lot of thinking about death. Obviously, there's going to be some hand-in-hand going on there with my tendency to overanalyze everything and also my tendency to think about death all the time. I think the most common way I experience my daily dose of death awareness is being hyper aware of any possible way that I could die at any moment. And I'm really not kidding, to be honest. That goes to driving a car. I mean, I'm not terrified to drive a car. I drive a car every day. But always in the back of my mind, I know that at any moment some person could careen into me and that could be it. Also for strangers, whenever I see some strangers doing some shoddy looking things, the first thing I think about is if they're going to die or not. For example, my biggest pet peeve is motorcyclists.
Oh my gosh.
I love you guys. I bet you feel so cool and it's so fun. But that's literally a death waiting to happen. Every time I see a motorcyclist jet by, not wearing a helmet, I'm just like internally screaming, oh my God, you're going to die. You're going to die.
In all fairness, though, a lot of organ donations come from motorcycle accidents. So, I mean,
I mean, that's a little bit of a morality discussion for another time. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, because I'm not a normal person, but I bet normal people don't usually, go around looking at motorcyclists screaming in their head that they're going to die. Another big one for me is like, kids running around unsupervised, especially in the parking lot. I actually have a reoccurring nightmare that I back over a child in a parking structure. Is terrible, just awful. I would never, ever, I don't know what I would do if that happened, but that's something that I think about often.
I think you're definitely not alone in that, because especially around driving, I get the same thing. Like when I pull into my neighborhood, I'm like, today's the day I accidentally hit a small child. Like, I'm super hyper vigilant of children for that reason.
Exactly. So as you can see, we are more susceptible to thinking about death in everyday situations. But I think even for myself, even before I started in the death industry, I was pretty in tune with death. And maybe that's why I am in the death industry after all. But I had never been to a funeral before I went to mortuary science school. Before I started interning at a funeral home, I'd never been to a funeral. I'd never seen a dead body. But even as a child, I think death was just something that I thought about, maybe more often than the normal kid. I actually have an extremely vivid childhood memory dealing with death. And in retrospect, I just have to say, I feel so bad for my parents dealing with this. So I had to be about 5 years old. And it was night. I was in my bed in my room, and I remember I couldn't sleep. There must have been like a particularly scary sermon from church, or maybe I had seen something on TV. But I remember for the life of me, I could not stop thinking about death. I remember so vividly laying in bed, my covers pulled up to my chin, and I'm thinking about one day my parents are going to die. One day my little brother is going to die. One day I'm going to die. So there I was, a 5-year-old little Jem under the covers, just sobbing my eyes out silently to myself in the dark, thinking about how it's all just life is going to stop. And that's a terrifying thought when you're a child, not having really thought about something like this before, or not having encountered death. We don't know what happens when you die. We don't know how it feels to die. So at this point, I'm freaking out, having a full-blown panic attack. So I remember getting out of bed and shuffling over to my parents' room in the middle of the night. It's pitch black in the house, and I creak open the door. Tears are streaming down my face, and I can hardly breathe anymore. And of course, my parents are woken up from a dead sleep, and they're freaking out, oh my God, what's wrong? I didn't cry a lot as a child, so this was very strange. And they were, did you have a bad dream? Are you hurt? And I'm just sobbing. And I managed to get out the words, I don't want to die. And I feel, in this moment, thinking back on it, I feel so bad for my parents, because that was probably the creepiest situation I've ever put them in as a child.
Oh yeah, B horror movie level.
And obviously they did the whole parent thing, oh yeah, everyone dies, but it's not going to be for a long time. Everyone's going to live to be very old and happy, that kind of thing. So they handled the situation as best as they could. But I think, even for me as a kid, it's so interesting. I always wonder what that moment was that you kind of realized that death was a thing, and that, one day everyone is going to die.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you kind of have somewhat of a origin story for that, because, I was racking my brain getting ready for this episode, and I was like, okay, what was the moment that I, was introduced to death that I was I know what death is now? Not even just being around death and not comprehending it. Most children can't really comprehend death in fullness. And, like the first funeral I ever attended, it was just in like elementary school days. It was for my uncle. And I really don't recall like understanding what was going on. Like it was just like me and my cousin ended up running around and we were playing just to keep busy because all the adults were like being boring or whatever. And the same happened with like going to my great grandma's hospital room and seeing her in bed, and like my whole family's there. We're all gathered around, and I'm not really understanding why everyone was there. I was just too young to make those connections that like somebody has died. So I really was trying to place, I'm like, so what was my moment? And really all I can think of is just my being raised on the internet. So the rest of my exposure before funeral service, like getting into funeral service in college, was just being raised on troubling internet websites like 4chan.
Yep. And that's such like a weird way to bring death into someone's life. But like, as our generation was really the first generation that was super just like exposed to the vast, crazy, wild world of the internet. And I think that affected us in more ways than we could possibly imagine.
Oh my God, yeah. Being raised on like all these horrific videos and pictures, like I was pretty desensitized to death way before mortuary science college, honestly.
Yeah, and it was really easy back then to get that kind of stuff, which like now as an adult I'm like, holy crap, like what are the kids doing these days? But I was a goody, so I wasn't part of the culture, but I can definitely remember friends like discussing things like that and showing each other videos, and I can see how that's like a weird kind of back doorway into getting a realization about death as a child.
Yeah, absolutely. Except, seeing everything as like, oh, wow, tragic deaths, traumatic murders. And it just was definitely not the nice, soft way I was hoping to have gotten the introduction to death, I suppose. But we all got to start somewhere, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Even in, we're recording this episode, it's the summer of 2020. So if you are alive now, you know exactly what's going on in the world. And I think it's crazy the amount of death and general morbid topics are in the news these days, just like blasted on your social media timeline or like, wherever you look on Google. And I think that it's going to change the generation beneath us, I think, and their exposure to death and how they deal with that kind of stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Gen Z is in for it because, I mean, I think every generation is built by the traumas that happen, like nation and worldwide traumas. I mean, we had 9/11, yeah, Hurricane Katrina, like all these different things definitely help to shape, your little tiny brain when you're growing up. Like, and maybe you didn't have a concept, but all of a sudden now everything on the news is talking about this. All of your parents are talking about this. So you get introduced in a very odd way.
Definitely. And then, as death professionals, I think death changes you in a way where it makes you, it's just in your everyday life. And when death is staring at you every single day and you're, pretty much buddies, like it changes you and it makes you feel a little bit different about how you live your life and how you sort of approach certain things. So actually, when I was in mortuary science school, I was living in New York City. And during that time, I was also dealing with a lot of personal things. I've had issues with depression my whole life, but I was also at that time coming to terms with my gender identity and my sexuality. And, on top of that, living in this giant, huge city that I've never lived in before. I came from the country. So I was really just kind of in a very, very bad place. And I want to throw in a warning here. I'm actually going to be talking about suicide and suicidal ideation for the next couple minutes. So if you want to click forward, if you don't have the mental space to listen to that right now, or if that's triggering for you, please feel free to click forward to the 19-minute mark. But I am going to be talking about that time in my life where I was actually extremely suicidal. And I actually really don't talk about this a lot. I haven't talked to anyone about it really, except like my therapist. But back then, so I was living in NYC, dealing with gender identity, sexuality, family issues. Back then, things were happening for the LGBT community, But if you think about it, marriage equality was ruled constitutional in 2015, and that's the very year that I was in mortuary science school. So long story short, it was definitely one of the most suicidal times in my life. And as an active student of the death and dying, I was thinking about death every day. And I guess I never really, until this episode, I never really thought about how that affected my time thinking about suicide. I remember vividly, though, standing in the middle of the subway platform. I used to ride the train an hour to school every day. I lived in Brooklyn. My school was in Manhattan. I rode the train an hour to and from every day. Suddenly, this thought popped into my head to jump in front of the train. And I knew that was how I would end it. I didn't even have to think about it. My brain was just like, this is it. This is how you're going to do it. It's right here. You can do it right now. And that's it. Like, you have to make this decision right now. But that one thought was so terrifying and so real. I knew exactly what was going to happen to my body if I did it. You know, we learned about these traumatic kinds of deaths in school. Like, I knew exactly what was going to happen. I knew the exact repercussions. My body wanted to die, and I was terrified of that thought. It's hard to explain in words, you know, in spoken word. I wanted to die. I was also so afraid. I didn't want to do it. But that thought just kept replaying in my mind. So during that time, it had to be a couple months, but I would get on the train platform and just think like jump in front of the train. You can do it. That's how you would do it. If you wanted to die, that's how you could do it. And I was like sure that I was going to do it one day. I don't really want to, get into the whole big thing, but thankfully I decided to reach out and get some help. I started to see a gender therapist and learning how to accept myself as a person and find the support that I needed. But I think that sort of mindset and the way that my body was kind of like going against my just primal fear of death. When I get on a train platform, my palms still get sweaty. Like, I can't stand near the edge or else like I get freaked out. Like, I'm not going to throw myself over the edge now, but like, it just traumatized me. And I think that knowing like the details of death and knowing exactly what was going to happen, I think that made it so real for me. And I don't know if that counts as a near-death experience, but I think what I knew about death at that time really kind of put suicide into words that I've never heard before, to be honest.
Yeah, it's really fascinating that you brought up like the conscious versus subconscious, like fighting against like yourself essentially to like want to die, but also being terrified of it. Like, I feel like, I mean, a lot of people have very similar experiences. Like, I personally have gone through a lot of intrusive thoughts, like coming back to vehicles being very dangerous to our health.
Yeah.
Constantly being on the highway, just being like, I could just, turn off this cliff. I could just pull right into this other car and then I wouldn't have to deal with all the things I'm dealing with. So
yeah.
That was really brave of you to bring that up, Jem. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you. Yeah. I think, like you said, I think a lot of people have had these thoughts, and I think it's important to bring it to light, even as a death professional, even though I'm exposed to death every day, like, I'm still a person, like, we're still human, like, we still got to deal with this stuff too, you know what I mean? But yeah, I think, like you said, with the vehicles, like, turning off the highway, it's so easy. It is easy, and I think a lot of people have that thought, but there is something, that keeps us from doing that, and I think that's, like, thinking about death in that way is a very interesting thing to me.
Absolutely. I too actually had myself a near-death experience. Before I go into that, I just want to kind of touch on like my current mental state. I think a huge turning point on my journey into like death and understanding it and what it means for me was that I had like an ego death and rebirth in college through means that I can't say on the podcast.
Right.
But that had really propelled me towards a lack in belief in an afterlife and pushed me towards actually being okay with my death and my like current life that I'm living. So I personally do not believe in an afterlife for myself. I just see the time that I have here as the time that I have.
Yeah, and we don't want to get into religion on this podcast, really. That's not what we're about. We don't really want to say that there is a right or a wrong. You know, it's all beliefs that people have, and everyone's entitled to their own belief, including Red.
Thank you. And yeah, that is super true. I mean, obviously, me believing what I believe, I still serve families daily that have beliefs that are different than mine. And I think it's just as important for people to be comfortable in their religion or lack thereof, and something that makes them feel comfortable and feel at one with their spiritual sides. So just as a kind of plug for that. But
yeah.
So on to my near-death experience. It was super late and I had just put a load of laundry in the dryer and my boyfriend was packing up and getting ready to leave and drive back to his house 2.5 hours away. And he had left late that day. He would have normally left like a few hours before he did. And I was super lucky that he was there. He noticed that there was like a strange buildup of moisture inside the house. And like there was like a bunch of moisture on the windows. And I was acting a little stranger than I normally am. And I just remember being like super, super sleepy during this time. Like I didn't really know what was going on. I kept trying to go to sleep, like honking out with the lights on. And fortunately for me, my boyfriend checked the dryer and the exhaust vent had fallen off the back of it. And my apartment had started to fill with carbon monoxide. So he flew open all the windows and got me outside into like the fresh air, it was like cold winter air too. I remember that woke me up a little bit. But if he would have left early, I would have gone to sleep and like never woke up.
Oh my gosh.
And after the fog cleared from my brain that night, like I wasn't really scared or upset that I could have died that night. I was just kind of like, okay, like about it, which is a little odd to think about now, but like I didn't feel like any particular way about my possible imminent death. I was just like, I got peace with it. Like I was okay.
And was that you were a death professional at this time? You were a funeral director?
Correct. Yes. This was just a few years ago. So I had been a funeral director probably for like 3 or 4 years at that point. Actually, probably 4 years. So yeah.
Yeah. You know, thinking about death every day, it does like change, you know, not saying that, I don't know, you just would have never known. Like if you died that night, you would have never known. And that's crazy. Right.
Exactly. And I think it kind of leads into like all these factors, all these things that lead me to feel how I do about my mortality today. I very much so like live in the moment. I live for myself. I live for my friends and my family, and also to just leave the world a little less stinky than it was before I came into it. So I feel like I found my purpose early in life, and I can like acknowledge my limitations, and I became super okay with me, or whatever other hippy dippy mantra you want to say.
Yeah.
But it was like a nice content feeling though, that to know that if I were struck out of nowhere by lightning, and die after that, I would be happy with what I've accomplished and what I've experienced and who I am at this point. So like living without regret has been very freeing in many ways. But who knows, maybe sitting on my deathbed, I might feel differently.
Yeah, exactly. And I have to agree with you. Like, that's what I tend to tell people who may ask me, like, you know, how do you deal with mortality? Like, how do you feel about your own mortality? I think that working as a death professional has just made me hyper aware of like I don't want to sound so sappy, but like the preciousness of life. Like really at any second, like today I could go to bed and get carbon monoxide poisoning and not wake up. And it's hard to think about that kind of stuff, but in the end, like I'm okay with that, because as I live with death every day, like Red, I think I choose to live with no regrets, or, you know, as many no regrets as possible. Like we're all human.
Right.
But being exposed to this stuff on the daily, like in my job now, I work with suicides a lot, and it's tough, but I think seeing that kind of humbles me in a way, I want to say, if that's the right word.
Yeah, I mean, essentially having gone through a similar situation yourself and basically facing that at work too. I mean, like that's crazy to think about. Like you have to be pretty okay with what you've been through to then go and help other families with what they're going through. I mean,
yeah. So I'm absolutely thankful for being a death professional. I think it's definitely changed my life in a very, very, very positive way. I feel great. I'm happy. I live every day like it's my last, pretty much as I can. And I can't speak for all funeral directors and death professionals, but I think that we're sort of privy to that. And I would love it if everyone else could experience that, to be honest.
Yeah, definitely. It's like taking this huge weight off your shoulders, because regardless of whether you believe in an afterlife or what your religion is, we can all still be happy to be here while we're here, even if there's some people that have something else to look forward to at the end, or some people that just want, that to be it, that to be their final goodbye. I think it's good to live in the moment, but to go back to what you said about death care professionals in general, strangely enough, I actually had a mentor. Just had started my apprenticeship, and my mentor, I was just shooting the bull with her one day, and I was like, so yeah, like, what do you want for your funeral? Like, what do you want to have done with you? And she was like, no, I don't want to talk about that. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. And she's like, I'm never going to die. So, ha ha ha. I was like, oh, honey.
That is very rare. I feel like I've never met anyone like that in the death world, but who knows?
Yeah, she's actually not in the death care industry anymore. So,
okay. Well,
there might be some correlation.
Yeah. Wow. So, you could either embrace death and live your life to the fullest every day, or you can just not even think about it. It's up to you.
And that's all for this week on MortMic. We'd love to connect with you guys on our socials, so like, follow, and subscribe to us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube at MortMic Podcast. That's MortMicPodcast. It would mean a lot to hear your feedback, so please tell us what you think in the comments. Maybe you have a near-death experience you'd like to tell us about, or what's your hot take on mortality? And drop us a rating on whatever podcast hosting site that you use. If you have any suggestions on topics you'd like to hear, or any burning questions you might have about death, please shoot us an email at mortmicpodcast@gmail.com.
I also want to give a huge thank you to our friend Marson for the use of his song titled Deputies of Death, which he produced just for our show. You can check out his Bandcamp at Marson, that's MARSON, music.bandcamp.com. Thanks, Marson.
And be sure to tune in every other week on Thursdays for more casual discussions on death. Thank you so much for listening. This has been MortMic.
Bye.
Bye.